Hello and welcome to The World This Week with me, Jonathan Steele. In Afghanistan, for the past 3 years, NATO has been training local soldiers and police in the hope that they will be able to protect the country when US soldiers withdraw in 2014. But a rise in the number of so-called insider attacks by Afghan soldiers and policemen against their NATO counterparts has led to serious concern about whether the Afghan army will be ready to take over the country in just 2 years' time. The US Army has suspended the training of new recruits and has sacked hundreds of Afghan soldiers in an attempt to put a stop to the killings. Here's Charlotte Hawkins with more.
US forces have sacked hundreds of Afghan army soldiers and have suspended training of Afghan police in some parts of Afghanistan after a spate of green-on-blue attacks on international forces over the past few weeks. The suspension of the training will affect 100 new Afghan local police recruits.
The reason for this was to allow for an intensive re-vetting process to take place for the already 16,300 current members of the Afghan local police. We remain very concerned about what we call insider threat incidents. We sit together with our Afghan partners and see how we can mitigate those incidents.
45 members of the International Security Assistance Force have been shot dead by rogue Afghan security personnel so far this year. This is already more than in any previous year. A spike in these incidents took place in August, with 15 soldiers being killed by Afghan allies. Insider attacks now account for nearly 1 in 3 international coalition deaths. Most have been American, although 3 Australian soldiers were killed in southern Uruzgan province last week by an Afghan colleague.
Let me clearly say that those incidents clearly do not reflect the overall situation here in Afghanistan, where almost 500,000 soldiers and policemen are working together side by side. Most of those incidents were either caused by personal grievances or by stress situations of the individual who did the shooting.
It is as yet unclear whether the recent insider attacks happened for these reasons or were linked to the Taliban.
We can clearly identify a direct insurgent connection to the attackers in about 10% of the cases. In another 15% of the cases, we suspect an insurgent link with the attacker.
Regardless of the source of the attacks, NATO has remained positive about the progress it is making in Afghanistan. This is despite increasing public scepticism within NATO countries about troops remaining in Afghanistan and New Zealand's decision this week to pull troops out early.
I will not exclude the possibility that the Taliban try to infiltrate the Afghan security forces, but once again, they will not succeed in derailing our strategy of Taliban infiltration.
If these insider attacks were linked to the Taliban, this may suggest they are still strong in Afghanistan. Suicide bombings are also still common, and President Karzai's recent reluctance to accuse the Taliban of being behind them has sparked fears he may harm the peace and reconciliation process. Even despite the suspension of police training, NATO forces are still expected to withdraw from Afghanistan in 2014. This is Charlotte Hawkins for Islam Channel.
Well, in light of what we've just seen, is a successful handover in 2014 still a realistic prospect? Well, with me to discuss the successes and failures of the NATO operation in Afghanistan is Orzala Ashraf Nemat, Afghan researcher and civil society activist, welcome, and Sheikh Abdullah Anas, who fought with the Mujahideen during the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan in the 1980s, welcome. He is also the founder of the Taruf Association for Conflict Resolution. Joining us by phone, we have Austin Long, Assistant Professor of International Relations at Columbia University in New York and former advisor to the US military, and also Dr. Paul Rogers, Professor of Peace Studies at the University of Bradford here in Britain. So let me come to you, Professor Long, first of all. In the light of what we've seen, can we really describe the attempts by the US and its Western allies to build an effective Afghan army as a success?
It's definitely a work in progress. It's entirely too early to call it successful, but I wouldn't say it's failed at this point either.
And what about the issue of whether or not the Taliban is responsible? The NATO spokesman, the ISAF spokesman, we saw saying that perhaps 25% of these so-called green on blue attacks were caused by the Taliban. The Taliban itself says they have done most of them. I mean, who do we believe?
I mean, I tend to believe, based on my own experience, that the real figure is probably closer to that of what ISAF is saying rather than the Taliban. The Taliban have an incentive to claim credit for most of these attacks, as it makes the United States and its NATO allies much more distrustful of Afghans. So 25%, 30%, the exact number would be very difficult to tell, but I think it's probably not a majority of the attacks.
But what is the basic reason, even if it's nothing to do with the Taliban, why is this happening?
I think that's a lot of thought is going into that right now, efforts by certainly the U.S. forces to try and figure it out. My own impression is that it's at least partially due to cultural and, in some cases, religious friction between coalition forces and Afghans. Some are personal. There have been incidences where someone was just offended at how he was treated. Other incidences, I think, are rooted in just misunderstandings between U.S. and NATO allies on the one hand and Afghans on the other.
Let me come to you, Sheikh Abdullah Anas. You fought against the Soviet Union in the 1980s, but you also allied with Western organizations and intelligence agencies and so on. Obviously, there were no Western troops on the ground, but you had to work with Western people. Do you think it is a cultural issue that the Western side does not really understand how Afghans feel?
Thank you for the invitation. I think we are discussing now in this mission today, we are discussing the pieces of the picture. If you go back after 9/11, after the launch of this war itself from the beginning was going nowhere. If we go back just after the 9/11, Afghanistan was the war was launched under two slogans. One is war on terror, and the other side is jihad against occupiers. And then after 10 years, everyone, even either Afghans or the international community, neighbors, everyone found themselves need to revise these two slogans. Because what you mean by war on terror? Every time attacking houses or killing civilians and saying sorry after 1 week, 10 days. We thought maybe Taliban were there in that village or in that house, and then finally we found just women there or children, or it was a wedding, or so this was repeated. And from the other side also the word of jihad needs to be revised. We are now, it's easily, you open the internet and you can see under the name of jihad sometime mosques blows up. Mm-hmm. People killed inside the mosque. So I think if we go back to discuss the real issue, Afghanistan now after 10 years of war on terror or jihad needs a political solution. So instead of discussing every day these pieces, this is the consequences of that wrong war from the beginning.
We'll come on to the issue of whether there can or should be a political solution in a second. If you don't mind, I'd just like to bring Professor Long in again, because I know his time is limited. Professor Long, you heard the Sheikh there saying, the issue of civilian casualties and houses being bombed and civilians being killed because it was suspected that Taliban were in the compound or whatever. Do you see any sense in which ISAF has become more careful about and stopping the excessive amount of civilian casualties it has caused?
Certainly over the past several years, ISAF has gone out of its way to try and reduce casualties, both from the use of airstrikes, from the use of so-called night raids. Afghans are along on virtually all military operations now. So I think there's been a real effort to reduce this. It's nearly impossible in a war that's fought amongst the population to reduce those casualties to zero. And, if you look at the most recent United Nations report, more than, I think, 2/3 or 3/4 of civilian casualties, according to the United Nations, in Afghanistan last year were caused by the Taliban, not by ISAF. So I think, while that's been an issue and it's going to always be an issue in this kind of war, you can certainly see ISAF has made real strides in limiting these civilian casualties.
Thank you. Let me bring in Dr. Paul Rogers, who's on the phone for us. On this point about civilian casualties, it is true, as Professor Long said, that the UN says the majority, by far, of the casualties are caused by the Taliban, yet somehow the political fallout of casualties caused by ISAF always seems to be greater. Why do you see that happening, Paul Rogers?
I think it's mainly because, from the perspective within Afghanistan, ISAF is seen still by at least a large proportion of the population as an occupying force, as occupiers. And although there may be a great deal of anger at times at the deaths and destruction caused by the Taliban, there is an even stronger feeling, even if the numbers are rather smaller, about the casualties that as a result of the ISAF actions. It's probably true that ISAF has become more careful, but we get very little firm indication from ISAF, in spite of the comprehensive bomb damage assessments, of the actual numbers of civilian killed. They don't really, in a sense, do body counts. And so I think the end result is a combination of a resistance to the effects of what are seen as occupiers, combined with the fact that ISAF has not been as forthcoming as it perhaps should have been in even indicating where it has clearly caused civilian casualties.
Let me come to you, Orzala Ashraf Nemat. The civilian casualty issue, has that become less or more important over the 10 years of the occupation?
Well, I think without any doubt it has become more serious in everyone's mind. In the first place, the civilian casualties, I believe, was one reason that mobilized many people to turn against the government and to turn against, specifically to turn against international forces, because of the bombings of weddings, as it was mentioned before, or bombing of people who are completely nothing to do with war on either side. So in the way the people are reacting, and still in most part of Afghanistan, is that they are finding themselves hostages by both sides, whether it is the government side in its supporters or alliance, or whether it is the Taliban or the other opposition groups that are fighting. And they are very much, I mean, sayings or talkings about this, that in the night one force is leading them, and during the day the other force, and both forces are pressurizing the common and ordinary people in their own way, and accusing them that you are working for the other. And we have seen more and more dreadful acts of slaughtering and public executions or killing of very young children. In the recent weeks, we are hearing some shocking cases of a child of 12-year-old being slaughtered or beheaded because apparently somebody from his family was working for the government, or the other way around. And the biggest challenge with these casualties, whether it is by the Taliban or by the international forces, is that it creates a complete chaos, and it creates an atmosphere of fear. And it is also becoming an issue that nobody knows where to call for justice. People are, in a very continuous way, are being killed, and it's very easy for the government forces or the Afghan security forces to say it was a Taliban. And now sometimes a situation comes that the Taliban immediately say, because maybe they are involved, maybe they are not involved, and they see that this is not going to be beneficial for them. They say, no, we were not involved in this case. So in the middle, we don't know who are actually responsible for these killings, of continuous killings of the Afghan civilians.
But you pointed out that the Taliban do take reprisals on people who are working with the government. Obviously, working in the army is the most dramatic thing somebody can do. Is it affecting recruiting into the Afghan National Army, that people are worried that if their son or their brother joins the Afghan National Army, they may be executed or killed?
Specifically, I think for this year, one of the statements that the Taliban put over was that we are not only targeting the international forces, but we are directly and equally targeting the Afghan forces, so that even the families of the people who are going. And I come from eastern part of Afghanistan, and I have been there for most of last year. I heard in many cases, for example, in Kunar and in Nangarhar, that when they are, especially in the villages where it is very easy to find out who is who, some people are finding it a little bit challenging to carry out the funeral ceremonies for their sons who are army officers or soldiers who are whose bodies are returned back or brought back. The same was the case with Paktia Khost and
this is kind of like a new Taliban policy, is it?
It is, yes, because they are pressurizing. They don't encourage people. And on the other side, when it comes to the Afghan national forces, they are a new generation. They are a generation of Afghans who brought up in this last 10 years. Most of them are in their 20s or early 20s. They don't have a very clear background as the many other older generation who had like the Mujahideen period mentalities and so. And they are caught up with different, I mean, this is also coming to that question of Afghan soldiers turning violent against their mentors or anything. They are coming with a mentality that Afghanistan should be an independent country, and this is what they are told by their Afghan mentors or by their Afghan leaders, starting from the president to everybody, that we are this brave nation, we are even like lions, and we have to defend ourselves. So those emotions become very high on the nationalism side, which I think it's important for a country to have soldiers who believe in that kind of nationalism sense. And they are finding it quite challenging to see the international forces on the other side with in a kind of environment where as soon as they are out of their uniform and out of their government role as soldiers, they are ordinary villagers, they are under the Taliban propaganda radars. So there is everything like injected to them that this is an occupation, these people are evil and all that, and then they go out also. So I think something is going on in the mind of all these young people that turned them to these kind of horrible acts of directly killing their mentors and attacking international forces.
Well, Paul Rogers, what about literally the sort of techniques of the training? I mean, it's been said that there's a sort of culture almost of shouting on a sort of parade ground in Britain or the United States. If the troops sort of are not in line and so on, the sergeant major shouts at them and says, get in line and so on, and perhaps they even use swear words. And that is said, is very much against Afghan culture. They feel insulted and humiliated if they're shouted at. Do you think it's literally something as basic as the way the training is done?
I think there are several things that contribute to it, and one certainly is that, the cultural differences in the nature of military training. But I think one also has to recognize that the attempt to train so many for the Afghan National Army, but particularly the Afghan National Police, it is being done at a very fast rate, probably by rather too few trainers, and almost certainly not with sufficient training, especially for the police. If one talks to young British soldiers, other ranks, recently in Afghanistan, they are very, very critical of the standards reached by the Afghan National Police. Now, that is from their perspective as foreigners in the country. One must accept that. But at the same time, what it means is that there is, I think, a real problem on a number of counts. Too much is being attempted too soon, and probably with not enough trainers, and certainly not enough trainers experienced in this kind of really very difficult training. you put that all together, and I think that explains to some extent the problems. It has been said, and we tend to forget this, that you have this old concept in Western military, but it applies around the world, of what is called the officer class. And the essential thing is, for historical reasons, Afghanistan, as of 10 years ago, did not have the equivalent of an officer class. And that, I think, has added to the problem. So, in a sense, there's a number of different issues, but it combines to end up with a situation in which the rate of training, leaving aside all the other difficulties, is simply not happening at the quantity, quality, or rate that is required.
Sheikh Abdullah Anas, let me bring you back in, because you mentioned earlier on the whole issue of political settlement rather than the military solution. Do you think that ISAF and the United States, particularly obviously as the leader of the coalition, is doing enough to try and get negotiations going, or is it really constantly stressing this idea of defeating the Taliban?
No, it's not the idea of defeating the Taliban. If we put the initiative of bringing peace back to Afghanistan and finding a solution, political solution, based on how to attack Taliban or to finish Taliban, it's not going to work. But let us say how to see the whole picture, how to work to bring back peace in Afghanistan. From the first day, as a member of the peace talks in Afghanistan, advisor of the High Peace Council in Afghanistan, and worked for the last 3-4 years trying to help if I can. And I visited Afghanistan many times. I met more than one faction in Afghanistan, from the government and people against the government. So the question is, now everyone must stop and think what to do for the future, because otherwise this kind of casualties is going to be repeated every day. It's not easy, it's not that a hard task, or it's not heavy duty to recruit an Afghan to fight, to come your side and say your land was occupied by non-Muslims or by NATO or by occupiers, or we have many words to be used in the internet, crusaders or whatever. It's simply, you are not going to struggle to see him answer or cooperate with you. It's simply, I am an Algerian. If I see French or British soldier walking in my village with his arms, with his uniform, I don't need anyone to tell me what he. And this is the nature of nations. You cannot imagine seeing in London, in the street of London, Turkish soldier with his arm, with his uniform in the streets, with his tank. It will provoke everyone. So it's not that big deal to recruit some Afghan angry. Government is not doing well. The ISAF doesn't. So that's why we don't like these peace talks or peace initiatives to get lost in finding these pieces. Goes to the real from where it's began. We thought we are here for the war on terror. Another group of the Afghans rose up to fight jihad against the occupiers. So now, 10 years, where we are is still we are doing. It's after it was launched. So I don't. Maybe your program is not will be not enough to explain everything here. There are many initiatives.
We actually have to make a halt here because we have a break coming up. We'll continue afterwards when we will focus much more on the future of Afghanistan after the withdrawal of foreign troops in 2014. So stay with us.